Thank you. Hello, hi. I have to admit something a bit weird before I start, which is they recommended that the brilliant technicians over there recommended I wear one of these microphones. I think in English you call it a head mic. And the first time I ever wore one of these was when I gave a TED talk. And as the technician put it on my head, I said to him, you know, if you make me wear this, I'm going to feel like Madonna. And he looked at me really intensely and he said, you should always feel like Madonna. So now, whatever I'm doing, when I wear one of these, I just want to randomly sing Papa Don't Preach. But believe me, you do not want to hear my musical skills. There's no way I'm here. Also, I should apologize. There is a small chance that I will die during this speech because my ancestors are from Switzerland and Scotland, so they never had one day at this temperature. So I apologize if I die. Also, the last apology I'll make, because I'm British, we apologize. I do not have a PowerPoint. I think we should legalize drugs and criminalize PowerPoint. I hate it. So you just have to look at my face. Nothing is ever made better by the presence of slides, in my view. So I want to talk to you about something I wrote a book about. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot as I was walking around here for reasons I'll explain in a minute. So the reason I was drawn to the topic of drugs and addiction is because one of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I was too young then to understand why, but as I got older, I discovered we had addiction in my family. Several members of my family, we still do. And when I started researching this topic, 12 years ago now, like a lot of people in that position, I was very divided, right? There was part of me that really loved the people in my life who had addiction problems and was really worried for them and could see that they were really suffering and felt a lot of compassion for them. There's also part of me that was quite angry with them, if I'm honest, right? I was thinking, why don't you just stop? Nothing I was doing was helping, right? Nothing I did seemed to make any difference. So I ended up going on this really big journey all over the world to research my book, Chasing the Scream. I went to loads of different places, got to meet a crazy mixture of people, from a transgendered crack dealer in Brooklyn, who's one of the wisest people I know, to a hitman for one of the deadliest Mexican drug cartels. He is not one of the wisest people I know. To the only country that's decriminalized all drugs with really interesting results that I'll tell you about. And really what I learned is that so much of what we think we know about this subject is wrong, right? Really core aspects of what I thought I had seen playing out in front of me all my life, I had actually misunderstood. And I opened the book with a story that I just want to tell you, and for like 2 minutes, you're going to think, why the hell is he telling us this story? What has this got to do with drugs and the war on drugs? I think if you understand this story, you understand so much of what's going on in Hungary now, what's going on in so many parts of the world. So, in 1939, in a hotel in Midtown Manhattan, the great black jazz singer Billie Holiday walked onto a stage. It was actually a stage just like this, a tiny little stage, and she sang a song. And the song was called Strange Fruit. I think probably most of you have heard it, but it's a song about lynching. It's a song about racism. It's the idea that in the deep south in the United States, there's a strange fruit that hangs from the trees, and it's the bodies of black men who've been murdered by racists, right? And as her goddaughter, Lorraine, said to me, you've got to understand how shocking it was for Billie Holiday to stand on this stage and sing this song. At that time, there were no political pop songs. They were all kind of like cheesy, you know. The most popular song at the time was called P.S. I Love You, right? And she's a black woman standing. They didn't even let her walk through the front door of this hotel because she was black. She had to go through the service elevator. And she's standing up and she's singing this song, right? And that night, Billie Holiday got a warning from the agents of a man named Harry Anslinger, who has affected the lives of all of us. Harry Anslinger is the man who invented the war on drugs. He's the first person to ever use the phrase war on drugs. And Harry Anslinger was running a government department in the US. So he ran the Department of Alcohol Prohibition when they tried to ban alcohol in the United States. And alcohol won the war, right? Alcohol prevailed. And when they ended the war on alcohol, most drugs in the United States at that time, cannabis, heroin, cocaine, they were all legal. And he wanted to keep his government department going. So he invented the war on drugs to keep his department going. And he built it around two really intense hatreds that he had. The first was a really intense hatred of black people. He was so racist that people called him racist in the 1920s, right? He used the N-word so often in official speeches that his own senator said he should have to resign. So extreme racist. And he hated people who had addiction problems. When he was a kid growing up in Pennsylvania, he was a farm kid. He grew up next to a farmer's wife who was addicted. He was terrified of her. He thought that addiction was contagious, that you have to crack down really hard on addicts, or otherwise they'll spread and we'll all become addicted. And Billie Holiday, the great jazz singer, was the symbol of everything he hated, right? She was a black woman standing up to racism, and Billie Holiday had an addiction problem. We know why Billie Holiday was addicted. When she was 11 years old, she grew up in Baltimore, one of the poorest parts of the US at the time. And when she was 11 years old, a 44-year-old man named Wilbur Rich came to her and said, "Your mother sent for me. She sent me to take you to her." So Billie went with this man and he raped her. This man was punished. He was sent to prison for a year. Billie Holiday was punished much worse. They said when she was 11 years old, the police, that she was a whore, that's the word they used, that it was her fault that she provoked this guy. And to punish her, she was sent to a convent where the nuns told her that she was evil, it was her fault, and they did all sorts of terrible things to punish her. And she ran away to find her mother. Her mother was working in a brothel in Harlem at the time. So she ran away to find her mother, and she started working alongside her mother in this brothel. I'm putting working in inverted commas because she was a child. So she's being raped by strangers for money every day, many times a day, as a child, right? Horrifically traumatizing. When the police raid the brothel, they don't rescue her, they send her to prison. They say that she was, again, they say it was her fault, right? So this really traumatizes Billie Holiday, and she deals with this by anesthetizing herself, initially with alcohol and later with a lot of heroin, right? And she develops this addiction problem. But in addition to having this addiction problem, Billie Holiday also becomes one of the greatest musical geniuses ever, right? She reinvents singing. People as different as Frank Sinatra and Jay-Z said that she transformed their music, right? So when Billie Holiday starts singing Strange Fruit, this song, which later, as Malcolm X says, was the musical starting gun for the civil rights movement, when they tell her to stop singing this song, does anyone mind if I swear? No? You don't look like you mind. Billie Holiday said, "Fuck you, I'm an American citizen, I'll sing what I fucking please." And that was when Harry Anslinger resolved to destroy her, this man who launched the war on drugs. So at the time, Harry Anslinger hated employing black agents in his department, but he wanted someone to follow Billie Holiday around, and he couldn't really get a white guy to follow Billie Holiday around Harlem everywhere. It'd be too obvious. So he got a guy called Jimmy Fletcher, a black agent, and he said to him, "Follow Billie Holiday everywhere she goes, document her drug use, we're going to send her to prison, actually we're going to bust all the jazz musicians," because he was convinced that jazz was this black music that was hypnotizing white people. This was the crazy way he talked, and they had to all be arrested. So Jimmy Fletcher followed Billie Holiday around for a year and a half. He got to know her really well. He danced with her. And Billie Holiday was so amazing. It's kind of obvious when you read the transcripts that survive of his interview that he fell in love with Billie Holiday. And his whole life he felt really guilty about what he did next. He arrested her, they busted her, she was put on trial. The trial was called the United States versus Billie Holiday. She said that's how it fucking felt, right? She was sent to prison for 18 months. She didn't sing a word in prison. But when she got out of prison, that was when the cruelest part happened. So at that time, to perform anywhere where alcohol was served, you needed to have something called a cabaret performer's license. Harry Anslinger made sure she was not given a cabaret performer's license, right? Another one of her godchildren said to me, "What is the cruelest thing you can do to someone? It's to take away the thing they love. they take away singing from Billie Holiday. Can you imagine a crueler thing, right? By the way, this is what we do all over the world today with people with addiction problems. In my country, Britain, here in Hungary, instead of helping them and supporting them, we put barriers between them and reconnecting with the society. We give them criminal records, we humiliate them, we imprison them. And in that situation, Billie Holiday relapsed. She starts to take out heroin and a lot of alcohol again. And one day she collapsed in the street, not far from where she sung Strange Fruit that night in New York. The first hospital they took her to wouldn't even let her in because she had an addiction problem. The second hospital took her in, but Billie said to her friend Maylie Duffy that Anslinger's men were not finished with her. She said, "They're going to kill me in there. Don't let them, they're going to kill me." She wasn't wrong. So in the hospital, Billie Holiday was diagnosed with quite advanced liver cancer. She was only in her 40s. Anslinger's men come and they arrested her on her hospital bed. They interrogated her. They wouldn't let her friends in to see her. They took away her record player. They took away her candies. They bullied her. I interviewed the last surviving person who'd been in that room, a man called the Reverend Eugene Callender. He was a religious minister, so they had to let him in. And he saw what they were doing. He saw that they were killing her. And he went out and he led a protest outside the hospital with big signs saying, "Let Billie live," right? There were big protests all over New York trying to save her. And Billie obviously was addicted to heroin. When she went into withdrawal from the heroin, which is quite dangerous if you're sick with cancer, obviously. So one of her friends managed to insist she was given methadone, a substitution drug for heroin, and she started to recover. And then 10 days later, Anslinger's men cut off the methadone, and she died the next day. One of her friends said it looked like she had been violently wrenched from life. They had to have riot police everywhere at her funeral because people knew that she had been killed by the war on drugs. And to me, this story, the reason I begin the book, the reason I'm talking to you now, beginning by talking about this, is because this tells you so much about what the war on drugs was about right from the start and what it's about here in Hungary, in my country, in Britain, in many countries, right? So you think about this, think about why drugs were banned, right? If we say, well, why were drugs banned 100 years ago? Why did we do it? I would have imagined, before I researched this, that we banned drugs for the reasons that we'd give if we stopped, a person walking past now. Why are drugs banned? They go, well, we don't want kids to use drugs. Absolutely. We don't want people to become addicted. That is not why drugs were banned. Everywhere in the world, drugs are banned because governments want to crack down on minority groups. Now, it's different minorities in different countries, obviously. In the United States, it was a pretext to crack down on black people and Latinos, right? Different countries here, obviously, you all know perfectly well, the police are not arresting people at this festival who have drugs. They are arresting people in poor neighborhoods who have drugs, right? Very similar dynamic. This is true everywhere where you have the war on drugs, right? And I learned so much about this story about why the war on drugs began, but actually, most importantly, Billie Holiday changed how I thought about the people I love who have addiction problems. Because very often we tell this story about people with addiction problems, even if we're compassionate, that they're just broken, they're just losers, maybe they deserve a bit of compassion. But here's the fascinating thing about Billie Holiday. No matter what they did to her, they put her in prison, they persecuted her, she never stopped singing that song, Strange Fruit. Never. She would go to the worst parts of the Deep South, where you didn't need a license, and she would sing that song, and people would throw bottles at her, and they would try to beat her up, and she never stopped singing that song. Never. And to me, this is a really important story, because in our culture, we only tell one heroic story about people with addiction problems, which is that sometimes they recover from their addiction. And that is a heroic story, and everyone here, and there'll be people here who've recovered from their addiction. You should be really proud of yourself. But that is not the only heroic story about addiction. Billie Holiday never recovered from her addiction. She was still a staggering hero, a genius who transformed music, and an extraordinarily brave, courageous political hero who resisted the war on drugs. When I think about her now, the person I think about is You remember the guy in Tiananmen Square who stood, Bagman we call him, we don't know his name, who stood in front of the tank, even though he could see the tank coming towards him, right? Sometimes people just stand up to unjust forces, and that is what Billie Holiday did. And we've never forgotten Billie Holiday's musical genius, but we also need to remember the political message she was telling us. At her trial, what she said was, I don't need to be punished, I just need somebody to help me. That is true of everyone with an addiction problem. Punishment makes addiction worse. And I want to talk a bit about why punishment makes addiction worse. Of all the things I learned from my book, Chasing the Scream, the thing that most surprised me is I realized that I had actually misunderstood the addiction I had seen in front. Sorry, this is my Coke addiction. I have to have some. I realized I'd actually misunderstood the addiction that I had seen in front of me all my life since I was a little boy. So let's talk about heroin addiction first, because that was close to me. So if you'd said to me when I started researching the book years ago, if you'd said to me, Johann, what causes heroin addiction? I would have looked at you like you were an idiot, and I would have said, well, the clue is in the name. Obviously, heroin causes heroin addiction, right? We've been told this story for 100 years. It was invented by Harry Anslinger. It's become totally part of our common sense. So we think, if any of you walked over to the road near here and you got hit by a truck, right? So this is true in Britain. I don't think it's true in Hungary. In Britain, if I walk out into the street and I get hit by a truck and I break my hip, I'll be taken to hospital and I'll be given loads of a drug called diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin, right? It's medically pure heroin. It's much better than anything you'd ever buy on the street, right? It's the good stuff, right? People in British hospitals are given diamorphine heroin all the time. If any of you have a British grandmother who's had a hip replacement operation, your grandmother has taken a lot of heroin, right? If what we think about addiction is right, that it's caused mainly or entirely by the chemical hooks in the drug. So we have this theory, right? We think if we were like, if all of us together, if we kidnapped those people over there, and we, like a villain in a Saw movie, we took them into a cellar and we injected them all with heroin every day for a month, 3 times a day. At the end of that month, they'd all be heroin addicts for a simple reason. There's chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to desperately physically crave, and they would, if we stopped giving it to them, they'd have this incredible physical hunger for the drug. That's why in English, another word for being addicted is being hooked. You crave the chemical hooks, right? It turns out that that's true. That is one part of addiction, but it's a very small part of what's going on. And one of the reasons we know that is because of these British hospitals. If addiction was caused mainly by exposure to the drug and the chemical hooks in the drug, what would be happening to all these grandmothers in British hospitals who have been given loads of heroin? They should be leaving hospital as addicts, right? They should be trying to buy smack on the streets. This has been studied very carefully. It never happens, right? People given heroin in medical situations for things like hip replacement operations do not become addicted. And when I first learned that, I thought, well, that just can't be true, right? How could you have a situation where you've got someone in a hospital bed, they're taking a lot of really strong heroin, they don't become addicted, and you've got someone in the alleyway outside injecting themselves, they do become addicted. How can that be? It didn't seem to make sense, and I only began to understand it when I went to Vancouver and interviewed an incredible man named Professor Bruce Alexander, who did an experiment that has changed how we think about addiction all over the world. So he did this in the 1970s. He explained to me, this theory of addiction that we have in our heads, that addiction is caused mainly or entirely by the chemical hooks in the drug, comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. You could try them at home if you feel a little bit sadistic and mean. You take a rat, you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. You look very excited by this. If you do that, the rat will try both bottles, and it will always prefer the drugged water, and it will drink loads of it, and it will kill itself within a few weeks, right? So there you go. That's our story about addiction. The rat tries the drug, it wants more and more of it, eventually it overdoses. But Professor Alexander was looking at these experiments and he said, well, hang on a minute. We put the rat alone in an empty cage. It's got nothing that makes life worth living for rats. All it's got is the drugs. What would happen if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats. They've got loads of friends, they've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of colored balls, they can have loads of sex. Anything a rat wants in life is there in Rat Park. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. And they don't know what's in them, they try both. This is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water that much. They use it a bit. They never use it compulsively. They never become addicted. They never overdose. So you go from heavy drug use, addiction, and overdose when they don't have the things that make life worth living to very little, no compulsive behavior and no overdose when they do have the things that make life worth living, right? I remember when I learned this, and there's lots of human examples of this. I remember when I learned this, realizing the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, important though that is to some people. The opposite of addiction is connection. The core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be. And when you understand that, you can see why this way of treating people with addiction that you guys have here in Hungary, that we have in Britain, that was invented by Harry Anslinger, the war on drugs, why it is such a disaster. Because sometimes we say, oh, it doesn't work. And that's true, but the reality is much worse. Punishment makes addiction worse, right? The war on drugs theory, which your Prime Minister, my Prime Minister put forward, is, oh, if someone's addicted, you need to punish them to give them an incentive to stop. But when you realize that pain is the cause of addiction, pain is the driver of addiction, suddenly you realize, right, actually you're making the problem worse. It's like adding fuel to a fire, right? So what's the alternative? The good news is places have tried the alternative and I've seen what they look like, right? So I'll give you an example of a place not so far away, kind of far away, but not that far, Portugal. So in the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in the whole world. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is kind of amazing. And every year they tried the American way more, the Harry Anslinger way. They arrested more people, they imprisoned more people. And every year the problem got worse. Until finally one day the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and they said, look, we can't go on like this with every year more and more people becoming addicted. So they decided to do something really radical, something nobody had done in 70 years since Harry Anslinger started. They said, shall we ask some scientists what to do? So they set up a panel of scientists and doctors led by an amazing man I got to know named Dr. João Goulão. And they said to them, all the main political parties said to them, they agreed in advance, you guys go away, figure out what would genuinely solve this problem, and we've agreed in advance, we'll do whatever you recommend, right? So the goal was just to take it out of politics. So the panel went away, they spent 2 years looking at all the evidence, including Rat Park, and they came back and said, okay, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna decriminalize all drugs, from cannabis to crack, everything, but, and this is the crucial next step, we're gonna take all the money we currently spend on fucking people's lives up, punishing them, arresting them, shaming them, imprisoning them, and we're gonna spend all that money instead on helping them turn their lives around. And interestingly, it wasn't really what we think of as drug treatment in Britain and the US, the countries where I spend my time, right? So they do a little bit of rehab, that's valuable. But actually, the main thing they did was a big program of housing, getting people housing, and job creation. Say you used to be a mechanic and you've got an addiction problem. They'll go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages, right? The goal was to say to every single person with an addiction problem in Portugal, we love you, we value you, we're on your side, we want you back. And by the time I went to Portugal, it was 13 years since this had begun, and the evidence was in. The best research on this was by the British Journal of Criminology. Portugal went from having the worst drug problem in Europe to being almost the lowest in the 27 countries in the European Union, right? Addiction more than halved, overdoses fell by 70%, HIV transmission among drug users fell by 90%, and one of the ways you know it works so well is that almost nobody in Portugal wants to go back. I went and interviewed a guy called João Figueira, who was the top drug cop in Portugal at the time of the decriminalization. And at the time, he said what loads of people said when you first proposed decriminalizing drugs. He said, this is crazy. We can't do that. We'll have an explosion in children using drugs. We'll have an explosion in tourists coming to use drugs. This is madness. And after 13 years of seeing it in practice, he said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen, and everything the other side said would happen did happen. And he said he felt really ashamed that he'd spent 13 years punishing and shaming and imprisoning people when he could have been helping them turn their lives around and saving their lives. There are loads of people here in Hungary with addiction problems who are dying, who, if they were Portuguese, would be helped, would have good lives, and would be contributing to the society. We can choose. Hungary, your country, my country, Britain, is choosing to copy the countries that have failed, like the United States, right? You think about the war on drugs. The one thing you can say in favor of the war on drugs is the United States has really tried it. They've done it for 100 years. They've spent $1 trillion. They've imprisoned millions of their own citizens. They've destroyed whole neighboring countries like Mexico and Colombia and El Salvador. And at the end of all that, they can't even keep drugs out of their prisons where they pay people to walk around the wall the whole time, right? And they have the worst addiction crisis in their history. If it was going to work, it would have worked by now. There are places that have approaches that have worked. I want to talk about something else that I was thinking about. So I've talked about addiction up to now, because that's obviously very close to me, my family. But actually, there's a fact about drugs I was thinking about as I walked around here. I'm sure no one at this festival is using drugs, but I was thinking about it as I walked around here. There's a fact that was very challenging to me that I learned from lots of scientists, people like Professor Carl Hart at Columbia University, which seems very challenging. So 90% of drug use does not lead to addiction, right? We all know this is true of alcohol. If any of you go into a bar in Budapest, anywhere around here tonight, you go in, you know that some of the people there are going to be alcoholics and they need help. But most people are drinking alcohol because, like people here, might have a gin after this, right? We do it to relax, to be happy. I was really surprised. That ratio is basically the same for all drugs. The vast majority of people who use cocaine, the vast majority of people who use almost all drugs do not become addicted, right? The ones who do become addicted, we've got to think about things like Rat Park. It's about they're trying to deal with an underlying unhappiness. But the reason I was thinking about that as I was walking around here before is I was thinking about a different festival. 17 miles out of Athens, there's a place called Eleusis. Has anyone ever been there? No? So there's a place called the Temple of Eleusis. And for 2,000 years, they used to hold a festival there once a year. People would turn up and you would be given a big cup to drink from, and you would start to hallucinate, right? It was a psychedelic cup. There was a debate about what it was. And you probably heard of some of the people who went to this festival. Plato, Aristotle. For 2,000 years, the leading figures in ancient Greece, including some of the founding fathers of Western civilization, who your prime minister likes to quote, they used to go to a festival very like this and get really fucked up once a year, right? What's fascinating about the desire to get intoxicated, to have an altered mental state, is this is a complete cross-cultural human universal. In every single human society, people seek out intoxicants and use them to get an altered mental state, right? Some scientists call it the intoxication impulse. It's as deep in us as the sexual impulse, all sorts of other impulses, right? You know when children, we will have all done this when you're kids, when you're a little kid and you start to spin round and round and round, kids do this when like 3 or 4, even though you know it'll make you feel sick, you do it because you know you want to get an altered head state. That's the first expression of this desire to have like an altered mental state, right? It's very deep in human beings. The only human society ever where they didn't have any natural intoxicants in their environment were the Inuit, what we used to call Eskimos in the Arctic, and they used to starve themselves to get an altered head state, because that was the only way they could do it, right? So this is so deep in human nature. So some forces in Hungary would look at this festival and they'll say, oh, it's, you know what they say. It's unnatural. It's against Western civilization. It's undermining the core of our civilization. Well, firstly, at the start of our civilization, it's there all along. But secondly, far from being inhuman, what is inhuman is the ridiculous fantasy that you can get rid of this natural human impulse. There has never been a society that got rid of it. There will never be a society that gets rid of it. It's part of who we are. And in most people, it's healthy. And if it's unhealthy, it's because those individuals have underlying problems that they're treating with the drug, right? So I just want to talk about one last thing. I want to tell you a story about someone else I got to know, who I think about a lot in relation to this. So you might be thinking, as you hear me say this, some of you will probably think, oh, I agree with him, but this is never going to change, right? This is a conservative society. It's never going to happen. I want to tell you about two people. I'll tell you 2 quick stories about people I know that I think should give you some hope. So one of them is a guy called Bud Osborne, one of the best people I ever met. So Bud lived in a part of Vancouver called the Downtown East Side. So it's a very poor neighborhood in Vancouver with a lot of people with addiction problems, a lot of chaotic addiction. You see a lot of people in the street who visibly have addiction problems, right? And he was homeless there in the year 2000. And he was just watching his friends die all around him. At that time, there was a big addiction crisis. One day, Bud was walking down the street in Maine and Hastings, for anyone who knows Vancouver, and he bumped into someone who told him that his friend Margaret had just died. And he was like, I can't take this anymore. His friends were just dying one by one. But Bud also thought, well, what can I do? I'm a homeless junkie. That's the word he would have used. I'm a homeless junkie. I don't have any power. I can't do anything. But one day he had an idea. So at that time, the police were really cracking down on people with addiction problems. So it meant that anyone who was using drugs would go and hide to use them. So they would go and hide in like big garbage pails or in abandoned buildings. And obviously, if you're using drugs and you're hiding and you start to overdose, no one sees, you just die. They find your body the next day or whatever. So Bud had an idea. He gathered together a load of the addicts and he said to them, why don't we just draw up a timetable? Just us, the addicts, we'll draw up a timetable and we'll go and look in the places where we use drugs. And if we see someone overdosing, we'll call an ambulance, right? Not any officials, just us. And people were like, okay, we'll try it, right? So they liked Bud, everyone liked Bud, so they tried it. In the weeks and months that followed, the death toll in the Downtown East Side massively fell, which was obviously great. It meant people who would have died got to live. But it also meant the addicts started to go, maybe we're not the pieces of shit everyone says we are. Maybe we can do something. So Bud was like, what can we do? What could we do next? So he went to the library and he read about drug policy. And he learned that in Frankfurt, in Germany, they had set up what we now call overdose prevention sites. So what they had was, if you had an addiction, you could go to a room And they would watch you while you used your drugs. Nurses would watch you and they'd give you clean needles. And they would, if you start to overdose, they would help you and they offer you lots of help for your addiction, right? And he discovered that in Frankfurt, in Germany, this had massively reduced the number of people who died. So he was like, okay, we should do that here in Vancouver. But there had been nothing like that in North America since Harry Anslinger shut it all down 70 years before. But Bud was like, okay, we'll persuade our mayor to do it. Everyone said, yeah, we're never going to succeed at that. The mayor at the time was a very right-wing politician called Philip Owen. He was a very rich guy from a very privileged background who ran for office saying all drug addicts should be locked away in the military bases and never let out, right? But Bud was like, okay, we'll persuade him. We'll win him over. So they developed this really interesting technique. Every time Philip Owen spoke in public, one of the people, the addicts, they set up a group called Vandu. They would stand up and they would say, who will die next, Philip Owen, before you open an overdose prevention site? He'd be like, what? And they built a coffin and they wrote on it, who will die next before you open a safe injection site? And everywhere Philip Owen ever went, a group of drug addicts followed him in the street carrying a coffin, right? And this went on for 2 years. And after 2 years, people were like, this has not worked. And then one day, entirely to his credit, Philip Owen, the right-wing mayor, said, who the fuck are these people? What is this? And he went and met them. He'd never met any addicts before, right? And it blew his mind. He thought they were like people who partied too hard. He met them. They were usually survivors of abuse. They were people who'd been through terrible things. And he held a press conference. And who was there? Philip had the chief of police, the coroner, and the addicts. He said, I'm never going to speak about addiction again without having these guys with me. And we're going to open the first overdose prevention site in North America in 70 years. We're going to have the most compassionate drug policies in North America. Things are changing around here. And Philip Owen's right-wing political party was so horrified, they deselected him. His political career ended, but the safe injection site opened. In the next 10 years, life expectancy on the downtown east side went up by 10 years. Thousands of people who would have died got to live. And then there was a kind of conservative government who tried to shut it down. They appealed all the way, the addicts appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Canadian Supreme Court ruled that addicts have a right to live, and that includes an injection site. That will never be taken away now. And there's many things I take from that story and getting to know these people and spending time there. One of them is, you might think there's no chance of change here, right? You might think, I don't have any power to do this. It is hard to think of a more powerless person than a homeless drug addict. That's what Bud Osborne was. He did not sit there going, someone else is going to have to solve this problem, right? He started where he stood, and he tried to persuade the people around him. And even when you've got nothing else, you've got a voice, you've got a human voice that you can use to persuade the other people around you, right? Bud died a few years ago. He was only in his 60s. And when he died, they shut down the whole downtown east side, and they held a memorial service for him. And loads of the people in that crowd knew that they were alive because of what he had started and because so many other people had followed, right, and joined in. But actually, I think the most important person in that story is not Bud Osborne. I think the most important person is the mayor, Philip Owen, the right-wing mayor, right? Because I've got to be honest with you, he was such an unlikely person to change his mind, right? But they worked really hard at it. And one of the great things about being a human being is you never know how people are going to change. One of my favorite movies, The Philadelphia Story, has a line in it. The time to make your mind up about someone is never, right? You never know who you're going to win over. You never know who you're going to persuade. People open their hearts. And with that in mind, I want to tell you one very quick last story, faster than that, about how things can change, because I know this is a time when a lot of you are feeling very pessimistic about your country and the possibility of change. And I understand why, and you're not wrong. But I want to tell you about a moment of even greater pessimism. One of my closest friends is a writer called Andrew Sullivan. I'm sure some of you know his work. Amazing American-British journalist. In 1994, Andrew was diagnosed as HIV positive. This was the height of the AIDS crisis. At that time, he thought that meant it's a death sentence, he's about to die. His best friend Patrick had just died of AIDS, right? And he thought, okay, I'm going to die. I don't have much time. He was in his 30s. So he quit his job and he decided to write a book, the first ever book to advocate for a crazy utopian idea, an idea that no one had ever written a book about before. The idea he was the first person to put forward was gay marriage, right? No one ever wrote a book about it before. And when I get pessimistic, I think, God, we're up against so many challenges, Donald Trump, all these things that are happening in the world. I try to imagine going back in time to 1994, to Provincetown, where Andrew Sullivan wrote this book, and saying to him, okay, you're not going to believe me, but 26 years from now, A, you'll be alive. That would have blown his mind. B, you'll be married to a man, because that'll be legal. C, I'll be with you when the Supreme Court of the United States quotes this book you're writing now, when it makes it mandatory for every part of the United States to legalize gay marriage. And the next day, you'll be invited to our White House, lit up in the colors of the rainbow flag, to have dinner with the president, to celebrate what you and millions of other people have achieved. Oh, and by the way, that president, he's going to be black, right? That would have sounded like the craziest. Let me go, okay, so 26 years from now, Viktor Orban will be replaced by a trans president who's going to invite you all to smoke crack with her, right? Doesn't sound very likely. But the world changes, not that we want that. The trans president, yes, not the crack. But, you know, well, I mean, no judgment. But you see, the world can get better in unimaginable ways if enough of us band together and fight for it. And that is absolutely true when it comes to the issue we've been talking about, addiction. For 100 years now, going right back to Harry Anslinger and Billie Holiday, we have been singing war songs about people with addiction. We should have been singing love songs to them all along. Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Thank you. Thanks.